Over 75% of the population in the United States considers themselves to be Christians. But just because they all believe in Jesus doesn't mean that they see eye to eye on every issue. For this video, we're going to address the issue of racism and try to find out why so many Christians today think that racism isn't that big of a deal or isn't a sin. But first, let's back up and look at some early American racism. England, 1609. People being persecuted for their Christian beliefs leave England and travel to Holland in search of religious freedom. After a decade or so in Holland, they realize that Holland isn't suitable for them due to the frivolous nature of the Dutch people. So, the soon-to-be famed Pilgrims traveled from Holland to the New World in 1620, landed in Plymouth, met the Indians, and the rest is history. Later, around 1670, Native Americans were captured by the Pilgrims and sold as slaves to the plantations in the Caribbean. This is considered by many people to be the first major act of racism in America. Now keep in mind, the people who were capturing Native Americans and selling them into slavery believed themselves to be Christians and acting righteously under God. Why? Well, we'll get to that in a minute. But now let's move on to racism against African Americans and slavery in the 1700s and 1800s. This situation was very much like that of the Native Americans. The people were being captured and taken from their homeland and forced into slavery. So how did these Christian people of early America justify slavery? Crossway Magazine, a popular Christian magazine today, gives a brief description of the justifications that early American Christians found in slavery. The article reads, "Reformed Christians recognize that there is a link between Old Testament Israel and the Church, both being God's chosen people. It seems as though many Christians at the time of the transatlantic slave trade took this too far. They assumed instead that Christendom was the new Israel, and therefore they could treat pagan peoples in the same way as Israel had done in the Old Testament of the Bible. As God's chosen people, they believed that they had the right to enslave inferior nations. These views can be seen especially clearly in the attitudes and practices of the founding Puritan fathers of the New World. If these views were characteristics of the general Christian attitudes of the time, then this could help to explain why some Christians kept slaves. Because of the fact that African Americans and Native Americans were considered inferior people, many Christians did not treat them any differently than any other non-Christians treated their slaves. This was probably the first racial mistake that early American Christians made. Just for clarification, the Bible doesn't say anything about owning slaves being sinful or unjust. However, the Bible does address the treatment of slaves in the book of Ephesians, chapter 6 and verse 9. Masters, don't threaten your slaves. Remember that you and your slave have the same master in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. But what does the Bible say about how Christians should treat other people? Let's find out. Love your neighbor as yourself. Luke 10:27. Whatever you wish that others would do to you, do to them also. Matthew 7:12. Don't judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment. John 7:24. These are some of the most important things for Christians to remember as they interact with other people. But have Christians crossed the line by being racist? I would say, yes, they have. The Bible clearly speaks out against racism of any kind, and Christians who willingly act in racist ways are willingly committing sin. Racism in America has only gotten worse since the slaves were freed after the Civil War. When the war ended, veterans of the Confederate Army formed one of the most racist groups in American history, the Ku Klux Klan. The KKK was founded in 1865, and former Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest was appointed the Klan's first Grand Wizard, or leader. Since its foundation, the KKK has committed thousands of violent actions against African Americans, Mexicans, Native Americans, Jews, and homosexuals. Today, the KKK denies that they are guilty of committing any acts of violence in America ever. Many people wonder why the KKK burns the cross for their rallies and rituals. Many people think that burning the cross is a desecration of the Christian symbol, but the Klan would say the opposite. According to the Klan's main website, lighting the cross symbolizes the light of Christ, dispelling darkness and ignorance. On the KKK website, they have many suggestions for their members, but surprisingly, they have only one requirement: that every person associating with the KKK conduct themselves with a Christian character. Well, that sounds like a nice thing to do, be a racist and be nice about it. But unfortunately, it's not the case, and it's not a plausible concept for Christians. To prove it, let's watch a short clip of a KKK rally, while keeping in mind that the Klan considers each one of its members to be a Christian.
Okay, come around, I'll get that banner. It's got to go. Somebody's got to carry it. What?
At rallies across America, the Ku Klux Klan assembles to preach its gospel of white supremacy.
Good morning, Dobson. We are the Ku Klux Klan. We hate niggers, we hate Jews, we hate faggots, and we hate spicks. We don't have to have a reason to hate them just because they breathe. We hate the filthy bums. You people need to get off your ass and wake up. This is America. The niggers are taking it over and the Jews. Make a stand. Join the Klan. White power! White power! White power! And I hate Jews. I hate them because they exist. I hate them because they breathe. I hate them because they're scum. The goddamn niggers are the scum of the earth. White power! White power! White power!
So we heard the word hate several times in that clip. But are we supposed to believe that since the KKK claims to be a Christian organization, that hatred is the regular conduct of a true Christian? But what does the Bible say about hate? Anyone who hates another brother or sister is really a murderer at heart.
Ideological leaders like Paul Ryan and Rand Paul have been making headlines recently for making racially charged statements during media appearances and stump speeches. But the problem goes well beyond the racist foundations of the Republican Party, and it's actually part of their strategy to destroy social safety net programs designed to keep people out of poverty. Joining me now to talk about this is Howard Nations. So Howard, Republicans today are talking as if they were living back in the 1950s, 1960s, or possibly even the 1940s. This racist tone that they're taking, all over the country, this isn't anything new, is it? I mean, we've seen this for decades now, haven't we?
Well, the Republican Party has a very firm racist foundation, starting particularly in 1964 with the Civil Rights Act and in 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. When President Johnson said when he signed it, "I fear that we have lost the South to the Republican Party for the next generation," he was a couple of generations off, because what happened was when he signed those two bills, there was a mass exodus in the South from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party because of the rights granted to minorities. The solid South, and it was as solid Democratic as you could be, became solid Republican. When I was raised in the South, there was a term about yellow dog Democrats, and the phrase was you could elect your yellow dog to the governor's seat if you ran him as a Democrat. Well, that changed in 1964 with the signing of the Civil Rights Act. So based primarily on race issues, the South shifted from Democrat to Republican.
And then they learned how to harness that resentment for the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, and that has been their strategy ever since. I know Lee Atwater, obviously one of the most famous people, but he really took it and ran with it and perfected it, didn't he?
He certainly did. There's a famous interview with Lee Atwater in 1982 when he was talking to a political scientist when he was explaining that, and I'm going to change he used the N-word. I'm going to change it to black. He said, you start out in 1954 by saying black, black, black. By 1968, I can't say black. That backfires. It hurts you. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you talk about cutting taxes. These are totally economic issues, but the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. So it was a very strong strategy that was racially based.
And so then it evolved from there. We got into Ronald Reagan, with his image of the welfare queen, and then even with George H.W. Bush with the whole Willie Horton attack. So, this concept of GOP racism, I know a lot of members of the Republican Party want to jump out and say, we are not racist, that you're making this up. But no, I mean, go back and look at the history that you've just described. This is all real. This is all verifiable. And this is what this party was founded on. And so here we are today, 45 years past. Has anything at all changed from those Lee Atwater and Ronald Reagan welfare queen images today?
That's an extremely good question, and there are two answers to it. And to get to one of the answers, let's look a little closer at Ronald Reagan, the hero of the Republican Party. Remember that Ronald Reagan opened his presidential campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi, the site of the murder of civil rights activists Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner. Just think about that. Then he campaigned, as you said, against the welfare queens. Reagan was famous for being quoted on the statement that he made to several audiences when he was campaigning in the South, talking about that it was frustrating to stand in line behind strapping young bucks buying T-bones with food stamps. This is still the president that's most admired today by today's Republicans. And remember that Atwater, who was the founder of the Southern Strategy, joined Roger Ailes as creator, who's the creator of the Fox echo chamber, in that whole Willie Horton strategy that was very instrumental, total racism, very instrumental in getting George H.W. Bush elected president. Roger Ailes is still at it. Just tune into Fox News any day. So has it changed today? There's a theory, the theory that it has is that today the racist underpinnings of the Republican Party are not really the goal. It's not racism, that the goal is to attack the safety net. The goal is to attack the food stamps and the recipients of food stamps, and that the racism today is a byproduct. I don't agree with that. I agree that that may be one goal, but the second goal of stirring up racism for the sheer sake of racism, for attacking minorities, is still alive and well, certainly in the South.
Right. And so you do have these folks. I know Paul Ryan is Wisconsin, but he recently came under fire when he said, we have these lazy inner city people who are dragging the economy down. They don't want to work. They just want to live off the government forever and ever. And that is one of the things that really sparked this whole renewal of the Republican racism. But if you look past that, it's certainly not the first instance, and it's not going to be the last. We have business leaders. We have Republican candidates who've said that I think KKK-owned businesses should be allowed to ban blacks. We have other Republicans out there who are saying, these lazy welfare recipients are no good. We have people like George Zimmerman out there at gun shows signing autographs. This, racism is at the heart of all this. And I agree with you completely. I think that you have the racism factor, and then also separately, you do have the attacks on social safety nets, which we're seeing coming from the Republicans on a daily basis. But they're trying to merge the two, and it's not working, is it?
No, look what's happening to your voter ID requirements today. They cut back on early voting, especially on Sundays, on the Sunday before elections. What is the purpose of that? Black churches had the Souls to the Polls campaigns, where they would take people directly from the churches to the polls because they could vote on Sunday. They eliminated that in several states. How is that not racism? In Arizona and Kansas, ID and proof of citizenship was recently upheld by a federal judge as a requisite for voting. Now, that's disproportionately affects minorities, but it also is a direct attack on minorities themselves as minorities. So,
well, you get into this voter ID issue, and I wanted to tackle one of the prevailing myths that Republicans have is, if you're a citizen, you have an ID, because obviously you can't get on an airplane if you don't have an ID. You can't drive a car if you don't have a photo ID. But what they don't understand is a lot of these people, obviously, if they don't have enough money for an ID, they're not flying around the country. They're not going on vacation. Most of them do not have cars. They live in an area where they can either walk where they need to go or they hop on public transportation. And so, yes, those voter ID laws do disproportionately affect minority, low-income voters all over the country. And we're seeing it especially bad down here in the South. I know we're in a horrible red part of Florida. You're in Texas. We see this firsthand, and you do see writers, you see phenomenal writers who say that, look, it's not really about racism. They're really just attacking the social safety net. And in some instances, in some places, that may be true. But I know what you see in your hometown, what we see in our hometown, is purely race driven.